Hey everyone, it's Lisa Swinney here from Business in Heels, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Ross Honeywill. But let me just give you a bit of a brief explanation because many of you were expecting to see Michele Levine from Roy Morgan, who has just got back out of hospital. And so Dr. Ross Honeywill has stepped in at the last minute, very thankfully, and he will be sharing with us some of the great information. Now, many of you know we're very passionate about gender equity. And we run the Gender Equity Awards, which are open, and you're more than welcome to nominate companies or great people to enter. And around about International Women's Day, Michele and I were having a fabulous conversation about what was happening with diversity, equity and inclusion in Australia, given what's been happening around the world. And Michele went off and this amazing presentation got pulled together, which is so fascinating. And I have to just say it's wow. But we're doing this on a new format for Ross. And so I think not only has he stepped in at the last minute, but he's dealing with a whole lot of new technology. So please forgive us as we wander through this really interesting presentation. But before we go on, I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here today. For those of you who are joining us from all over the country, please pop in which country you're coming from. For me, it's the Wathaurong people, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and share in welcome anybody here today who's a Torres Strait Islander. So it's exciting, and I'd like to briefly introduce Ross to you so that you know about a little bit more about the man that's going to be presenting this. Dr. Ross Honeywill is a social scientist. He's an author and a corporate advisor. He pioneered the neo-consumer typology and is an expert in gender equity, social intelligence and consumer behaviour. So perfectly set up to share with us today. His work challenges conventional thinking and has shaped strategy for governments, major corporations and boards across Australia and internationally. So welcome, Ross. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'll push on with the slide deck. As you said, I'm doing it from my iPhone, which is a novelty for me. So thank everyone for being patient with it. Lisa's running the slides and I'm running the audio. So let's move on and let's get going. So today I'm going to reveal how our changing culture is affecting women, both positively and negatively, and how men are responding to these positive developments for women. After all, there's a history of men striking back when they view women as getting what they might call, getting above their station in life. And I'll reveal truly alarming statistics about the attitude of young men towards women. Finally, I'm going to offer a few suggestions on how we might reverse this masculine resurgence. So let's start with some good news. Thanks, Lisa. Yep, beautiful. Starting at the beginning, in my book titled The Man Problem, I argue that periods of significant progress in women's rights are frequently followed by a masculine backlash. It's important to say that not all men are the problem, but at the heart of just about every problem, you'll typically find a man. I also propose that most men have a deep sense of unearned privilege, and that this is the root cause of what I call remasculinization, where traditional male dominance resurfaces to tear at the fabric of society. Thanks, Lisa. When we talk about gender equality, we mean same for everyone. So let's just get a bead on what the difference between gender equality and gender equity is. Just like disinformation and misinformation, these two are not proxies for each other. They're very, very different terms. And gender equality and gender equity are vastly different. So when we talk about gender equality, we mean the same for everyone, identical rules, resources, and opportunities. This sounds fair, but it assumes everyone starts from the same place. By contrast, gender equity recognizes that people have different starting points. people are different and have different starting points. Equity tailors support and resources to level the playing field so the outcome is genuinely fair. In other words, equality is about uniform inputs and equity is about fair outputs. If we want real change, ticking the equality box won't cut it. We must invest where it's needed and needed most, and that's in gender equity. Thanks, Lisa. When we talk about, right, sorry. Well, gender, so forgive me, you're just going to have to be patient with us while we manage through this. While gender equity is the foundation, equity and diversity are two hands in one glove. When we deliberately bring a wider range of, when we deliberately bring a wider range of gender experiences into every discussion, every project team, we enrich our decision making. Diverse perspectives shine a light on blind spots and challenge groupthink. They help us spot risks earlier and uncover opportunities that a more homogenous group would miss. In other words, tying equity to true diversity is what transforms fairness into performance. And that's precisely what Harvard Business Review shows, embedding genuine gender diversity into your culture, beyond just meeting quotas, drives creativity, accelerates problem solving, and delivers measurable productivity gains. So HBR reports that next slide, thanks. Harvard Business Review reports that genuine gender diversity, when woven into an organization's culture rather than treated as a tick box, drives real productivity and innovation. The difference lies in embedding inclusion in every process, every meeting, and every decision, not merely hitting quota targets. It makes one thing clear: diversity pays, but only when it's real. Simply hiring a mix of men and women isn't enough. When inclusion is truly embedded, you unlock fresh perspectives that fuel creativity, accelerate problem solving, and drive measurable productivity gains. Next slide. We've seen real payoffs when women rise into leadership. Better decision-making, stronger returns, more resilient teams. Yet paradoxically, in moments of upheaval, war, the energy transition, climate shocks, or even the cost of living pressures, we witness a rollback, men reasserting traditional roles, clinging to control. It's as if crisis triggers a collective retreat to the familiar image of the strong man in charge. That push towards remasculinization not only stalls progress, it risks undoing hard-won gains in gender equity and diversity. So let's look at how and why this backlash takes hold. Thanks, Lisa. As I said, in times of uncertainty, like cost of living strain, social and political upheaval, we instinctively seek familiar structures. Right now, we're seeing a major swing to remasculinization that not only stalls our gains, but makes the national psyche more fragile. Next. Remasculinization isn't a modern fluke. It's a pattern we've seen for centuries. Take the Enlightenment. Radical ideas of liberty and equality promised to upend every hierarchy, including gender. Yet as women agitated for rights, men in positions of power rallied to reassert traditional norms, legally, socially, and culturally, ensuring women remained second-class citizens. That same instinct to cling to familiar gender hierarchies resurfaces today whenever progress feels too rapid or threatens the unearned masculine privilege. Thanks, Lisa. During both world wars, millions of women stepped into factories, farms, and offices to keep economies and the war effort running. Yet when soldiers returned, those same women were told to go home and make way for the men. Men outraged that women had taken their jobs overlooked the fact that women had kept the country afloat. That post-war backlash restored a rigid gender order, despite women's capabilities being so proven as equal to men's during the war. Next. My favourite example of the empire striking back occurred in the 1950s when Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine started a post-war men's rebellion against the feminization of their lives. Hefner established the Playboy office in Chicago as the masculine headquarters, a war room for male propaganda. Men increasingly felt banished to the shed, so Hefner's editorial vision was to reclaim the indoors for men, curious, presenting the Playboy lifestyle as an escape from domestic subjugation and a reclaiming of masculine spaces appropriated by women. Hysterical. Thanks, Lisa. And get this, Playboy's inclusion of nude photographs was designed to re-feminize women who had been so-called defeminized by manual labor during the war. I guess women just couldn't take a trick. Next. Having seen post-war remasculinization, it's happening again. After decades of progress, women's gains in education, leadership, legal rights, a new wave of masculine retrenchment is on the move across boardrooms, politics, and popular culture. Familiar power dynamics are resurfacing as many men push back against changing roles. This backlash doesn't just stall equality, it actively undermines the hard-won gains in gender equity. Next, let's explore concrete examples of this 21st century backlash in action. Thanks, Lisa. Over the past decade, media and entertainment have increasingly championed hyper-masculinization narratives, celebrating aggressive male dominance, physical strength, and authority. Rap music often normalizes violence and objectification of women, while movies and television continue to amplify the trope of the dominant, powerful male reclaiming his rightful place. These cultural messages not only reinforce harmful stereotypes, but they subtly legitimize gender inequality, reversing progress towards genuine equity and respectful relationships. Next. Products like large, aggressively styled trucks and rugged caravans, they're not just vehicles. They symbolize a renewed emphasis on traditional assertive masculinity. You'll see these every day on our streets. These products appeal to identity and status, reinforcing traditional gender stereotypes. Now, while some might dismiss this as harmless consumer choice, it's crucial to recognize how deeply these symbols embed themselves in societal attitudes, potentially reversing gains in gender equity by reinforcing traditional male-dominated norms. Next. Perhaps the most troubling cultural influence today, particularly among teenage boys and young men globally, is the controversial misogynist Andrew Tate. Tate aggressively promotes hypermasculinity, openly advocating anti-feminist ideologies and urging young men to reclaim traditional masculine dominance. Alarmingly, Tate's toxic messaging, which demeans women's roles and promotes unhealthy views on relationships, has directly contributed to increased sexism, harassment, and concerning attitudes towards women among boys in Australian schools. This trend underscores a significant and urgent challenge for parents, educators, and society at large. So what light can Roy Morgan data shed on this resurgence? This whole thing isn't just anecdotal. It's not just academic. Over the past decade, there's been a dramatic jump in Australian men who think women belong at home rather than in leadership roles. That rise in conservative attitudes quantifies the remasculinisation trend we just saw in history and popular culture. It's a stark reminder that without active intervention, cultural backlash can erase progress pretty much in a heartbeat. Thanks, Lisa. And there's, so next, yep. And here's the evidence. Roy Morgan data reveals that over the past decade, the share of men agreeing that women should just stay in the home and leave running the country to men climbed from 7.8% in early 2015 to 9.5% by mid-2024. That's a 22% increase. Put another way, more than 1 in 10 men now endorse a traditionalist view that would again roll back women's social, political, and economic contribution. That's a measurable shift in attitudes, and it underpins the very remasculinisation trend I've been talking about. And it shows why we can't treat gender equity as a set and forget exercise. Next. Now, here's the kicker. Women's own support for the stay-at-home norm also jumped by an alarming 40%. And equally counterintuitively, that shift isn't confined to older generations. It appears among younger women and it appears in younger men. Additionally, Roy Morgan's data shows a stark generational divide, and we'll explore that on the next slide. Support for the idea that women should just stay at home is equally alarming because it's being led by young 18 to 34-year-old men, and it's surged by 52%. So this younger age group is absolutely alarming. And it's the opposite of what we might have imagined. Certainly, I assumed that young men would be more progressive than their fathers, more equal, more open, more evolved. So it's not just the old guard dragging us backwards. It's not just old white men doing this. It's the next generation of young men. And they're not just the future employees. They're the next wave of CEOs, policymakers, and board members. Next. And then there's Trump. There's always Trump. And the cultural engine he's powering. Around him, a growing chorus of political influencers and tech billionaires are resurrecting so-called traditional values, attacking feminism and romanticising a return to Hefner's 1950s-style gender roles. Now, it's not just a conversation, it's a sledgehammer. The Trump era's crowning blow to women's rights was the reversal of Roe versus Wade, a seismic rollback of bodily autonomy. This isn't just about the US. The influence of this anti-woman culture spreads, and it spreads fast. And it's reshaping how young men, our future leaders, see diversity, gender, power, and permission. Thanks. And speaking of diversity, Australia is proudly multicultural. But cultural diversity doesn't automatically mean gender progress. Roy Morgan data also shows that Australians born in China, India, the Middle East, and the South Pacific are twice as likely, that's 100% more likely, to believe women should just run the home. So it's not just a homegrown remasculinisation, that's imported bigotry, and it's now embedded in our population mix. Next slide. So let's talk about wealth not income, but accumulated wealth, which shapes power, security, and influence. In 2007, women in Australia held just 82% of the wealth men did. By the time COVID hit, that gap had narrowed, so women were up to, the gap was 91% of the wealth that women held by women compared to men. But since then, progress has virtually stalled. It's now sitting at 92%. Despite a decade of economic growth and equality rhetoric, the rate of catch-up has slowed dramatically. Wealth builds slowly, and without active correction, the gap simply persists. This is why equity can't rely on time alone. It takes deliberate, sustained action to close the gap. Next. And look where women are positioned on the wealth ladder. Men are overrepresented in the wealthiest 2 deciles, while women are overrepresented, while women make up just 47%. That's in the top 2 wealthiest deciles. On the flip side, women are overrepresented in the poorest 2 deciles. So men dominate the top, and that's definitely not equitable. That's structural imbalance, and it's still alive and well. Thanks, Lisa. In slightly better news, women's average personal income more than doubled between December 2007 and December 2024, growing 117% from 26,540 to 57,550. In contrast, men's income grew only by 78% compared to 117% for women. So men's grew by 78% from 44,400 to 78,980. So yes, the income gap is slowly narrowing. But before we celebrate, let's remember, starting from a lower base means women had more ground to cover just to catch up. And income gains alone won't shift entrenched wealth disparities or representation at the top. Thanks, Lisa. Here's what helped narrow the income gap. More women moved into full-time work. Since 2012, the share of women working full-time jumped from 28.2% to 36.7%. Meanwhile, the figure for men barely moved, essentially flat at around 55.8%. That rise in full-time participation is progress, but let's not get carried away. Even with more women working full-time, pay gaps, promotion gaps, and leadership gaps remain. The percentages are definitely improving, but the reality still isn't equitable. There are 3 persistent myths that quietly sabotage progress on gender equity. First, meritocracy fixes inequity. Sounds fair, but assumes a level playing field that simply doesn't exist. When bias shapes opportunity, merit becomes a cover for the status quo. Second, quotas compromise merit. In reality, quotas expose where merit has been overlooked. They don't lower standards. They force us to look beyond familiar networks. And third, gender inequity will naturally correct itself over time. Well, it won't. The data shows clearly, without deliberate intervention, the gap stalls or even widens. Younger people are becoming more believing that women belong in the home. So waiting is simply not a strategy. So gender equity doesn't start with HR. It starts with leadership. Leaders set the tone for what's acceptable, what's rewarded, and what gets ignored. If equity isn't on the leadership agenda, it won't gain traction anywhere else in the organisation. Commitment from the top isn't just symbolic, it's structural. It drives accountability, investment, and cultural momentum. And the organisations that truly thrive, they treat gender equity not as a discretionary side project, but as a core metric, measured, reported, and tied to leadership performance, and dare I say it, bonuses. Next slide. So, what can each of us do to push back against remasculinization and gender inequity? Thanks, Lisa. Let's immediately start by changing the language around gender. I call it gender flipping. Let me get you going. Thanks, Lisa. First, stop talking about the disadvantage women suffer, flip the language, and talk about the advantage men enjoy. Next is in 2024, 64 women were killed by the man who supposedly, let me say this again. In 2024, 64 women were killed by the men who supposedly love them the most. But we only ever hear about the woman as victim, not the man as murderer. So let's stop talking about the number of women murdered by men and start talking about the men who murdered them. Next, and let's stop saying women are underrepresented in the workplace or parliament, for example, and start talking about men being overrepresented. Next time someone has a conversation about women being underrepresented in parliament, have a talk to parliamentarians who are men and say, work out which of you are going to resign to make place for women. That's flipping the agenda as well as the language. And finally, we can all make a difference every day. And what we need to do is to stop talking about women and children. Every time I listen to the news, particularly in Gaza, they talk about bombing the hospital. They don't say how many men were killed, but they say, and even women and children were killed. And it just puts women at the same level as hopeless children without any agency whatsoever. If you need to conflate them, then let's start saying women and their children. So, next slide, and it's back to everyone else.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Ross. I love your idea of actually gender flipping. What a great idea, and so practical. And yet, as you say, we dwell on the person that's been the victim. We always talk about the victim rather than the perpetrator. Some fabulous ideas in that. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in chat. But I think most people are probably still in shock by the fact that it came out as being younger people. I think for me, when I first saw this, it was actually a real surprise. I anticipated that we would see some change as a result of, as you suggested, the Trump sledgehammer. But I certainly wasn't expecting it to see it in the youth. And I immediately sat my son down, who's a 23-year-old, and I said, what do you think about this? So, subject matter of one, right?
What did he think?
He actually hadn't come across it, but was aware of obviously what was going on in social media and stuff. And mind you, he's probably got a more biased family life than many because of what I do. However, he was aware of it, and it was interesting because one of our local areas, a soccer club actually had a bunch of young guys dress up for what they said was a bit of fun, but as neo-Nazis, and everybody was really horrified and they got kicked out of the club. But, as a result of that, I think everybody was really sort of shocked at how close to home it was, because I think most of us think, well, it's not. It's a bit like, it's not my problem.
It makes me think I really need to put one more dot point up on the gender flipping thing, because this whole thing about boys will be boys is just this incredibly privileged excuse for young men in particular, or all men, behaving ridiculously, and oh well, it's just a joke. You can be telling sexist jokes, making sexist moves, behaving in a completely inappropriate way. Oh, it's just a joke. You don't have a sense of humor, and we really need to flip that one.
So, Ross, if you had to give people who are listening to this some advice, in addition to gender flipping, and how would they lobby internally within organisations to try and shift that thinking at the C-suite level?
One thing I know about particularly convincing men, is that they're weak in the face of evidence. And I think the best way to do this is to actually take the data, because the data is completely shocking. I first found this data in Roy Morgan, the fabulous single source database they have, about, I don't know, 10 years ago, when I was actually writing the book. And Michele was kind enough to give me access to the data. And I was completely shocked at two things. One was the fact that they were younger and they were men, and the fact that it was young women as well. And I just found this incomprehensible. So to come to the point, one of the things I think, if you're trying to convince people in power, influencers, the best way to do it is to use the evidence to talk about it, but also to use the lighter touch as well. And that's where the gender flipping thing comes in, so that it kind of lightens the room, and but it's also unbelievably compelling, because the logic is impeccable. They look at that and think, oh my God, I never ever thought of it that way. And when you combine those two, I think they're the things that I would be using to convince anyone. You don't need to go back into the history or talk about Ross Honeywill's theories about remasculinization and all that kind of stuff. But you do really need to understand that, it isn't as ideologically comfortable as the people in power, the leaders, might think. And it's really important to kind of disrupt their thinking, and then to give them something light that they can talk to their wife about and talk to their kids about, without it being the heavy topic.
The other thing that occurred to me when I first saw this data was that it's really quite important for companies to have a good education policy on why the equity piece exists. Because many people who are new, and maybe as a graduate, you just come out of university and you're coming into an organisation for the first time, is that short window, isn't it, where we see for the first time that women's earnings potentially outstrip men's. And it's before children come into the thing, and then women usually go into the gender pay gap issues, and so it's actually a lot of young men have no understanding as to why we've got so many women retiring poverty. There's a lot of these macro issues that they're just thinking about from their own selfish perspective. It's my first time in the workforce. I'm looking forward to getting a great job. Why aren't I getting opportunities, and why can't I see myself getting more leadership sort of things in the future, where if they're seeing lots of equity pieces within organisations. So have you got any advice for us for companies to try and actually improve this sort of educational piece as to why the equity is required for women within organisations?
Yeah, the one thing that, having worked in very large organisations and knowing that one particular global organization that every year there'd be another consultant that came in, and they'd come up with another way of segmenting the workforce and saying what kind of personality you were. You know, one year I was a color, next year I was a different kind of named segment, and the following, and you'd do this for a week, you'd think about it for another week, and then you wouldn't think about it again for another 50 weeks until the next one came back, next year. So the thing definitely not to do is to make this, a kind of educational process. The best way to do this, there are a couple of things that are important. Past behavior does not determine future behavior. Attitudes determine future behavior. So attitudes can be changed quite quickly, and behavior can be changed in a heartbeat. But behavior won't change unless the attitudes are changed. And in my experience, the only way to change the attitudes is to actually have particularly young men role playing in front of their peers. So to set it up so that they're talking to each other or they're talking to a young woman, and set the scene with particular scenarios and have them run through it. And it's remarkable because try as they might, they'll fall into traps. Now, it doesn't mean you then criticize them for it, but everyone can talk about what happened and what they've just witnessed together. And it's only by role playing that the attitudes change. The rest of it doesn't matter. So you can set all the quotas, you can set all the rules. One large organization, I remember an email came out that women were not to wear outfits that had bare shoulders. And but the really cute bit about it was that the moron who sent it spelt it BEAR, not BARE. So it just kind of really sums it up for me. But unless you can actually change the attitudes, you definitely won't change the behavior. And putting it in writing, making people to sign up to something, having people agree to some kind of rule just doesn't work. Unless they get it, unless it emotionally connects with them, then they're never going to change.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think maybe, as you say, it's about teamwork and trying to get people to actually see how they're perceived. I love it. Thank you so much, Ross, for joining us and for sharing such wonderful and so empowering, actually, information. And I think hopefully for those of you who have watched it or are yet to watch this, will find it really useful in providing you with some of the ammunition you need to potentially take it back to the workforce, take it back to your team, talk to the young people in the community. As I said, I was really surprised that it was coming from our youth. So thank you very much for sharing great information with us.
Thanks, Lisa, and it's a pleasure. And thank everyone for being so patient with the technology.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.